Some people think it's the only thing that will save us. Other people think it will destroy anything it touches. What exactly is socialism? And should we try it? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Imagine you work in a factory. You show up every day and you operate the machinery. Let's say you make chairs. At the end of the month, all the chairs sell for $100,000. Your paycheck is only $3,000. The owner of the factory, who hasn't touched a tool in years, pockets the rest of the money. Now, here's the question. Is that arrangement just? Socialists will say, no. The person who did the work should get the value of what she produced. The owner is extracting wealth from her labor. He's not earning that money, he's taking it. The capitalist says, yeah, the owner bought the machinery, took on the risk, organized the production, and is entitled to the profits. Without him, there's no factory at all. The worker agreed to the wage voluntarily, and nobody forced her to take the job. So who's right, the socialist or the capitalist? That question sounds like economics, but it's actually philosophy. And the answer you give will depend on your deep assumptions about freedom, property, justice, and what human beings are actually for. Today, I want to take you through the philosophy of socialism, carefully, rigorously, and honestly. We'll see what it actually claims, what arguments support it, what arguments undermine it. And almost everybody on all sides get at least one thing wrong about it. In fact, socialism might be the most misused word in politics today. Depending on whom you ask, it might be the answer to inequality or the road to destruction. It's Scandinavia or it's Venezuela. It's Bernie Sanders or it's Joseph Stalin. The word gets thrown around so carelessly, it often becomes meaningless in modern conversation. So let's look at socialism from a philosopher's perspective. We'll define it precisely, trace its intellectual roots, present the strongest arguments for and against it, and assess where the weight of reason actually falls. We'll also look at the difference between socialism and the welfare state, socialism and communism, and whether the Nordic countries are actually socialist or not. Let's start with what socialism actually is, not what politicians say it is, not what most people think it is. What is it as a philosophical and economic position? Socialism is a political and economic system in which the means of production are owned collectively, either by the workers or by the community or by the state, rather than owned by private individuals. And by means of production here, we mean not only the factories and the tools, but also the land, the natural resources, whatever it takes to produce goods and services. And that's it. That is all that socialism actually is. It's a claim about ownership. It says that the land, the machines, the factories, the resources, all of that are used to produce wealth should be owned collectively, not by private individuals. Notice what that does not include. Socialism is not about taxes. It's not about government programs. It's not about healthcare or education or food stamps. Those are features of the welfare state, which is a completely different thing, and we'll come back to that. Socialism is specifically about who owns the means of production, and everything else follows from that. It is important to distinguish, by the way, when we're talking about private property, we don't mean what you typically would think. So a socialist might say that he or she wants to abolish private property. They don't mean, I want to take your house and your car and your toothbrush and stuff like that. What they mean is, I want to take the means of production, whatever it is that you could own that would produce wealth. This distinction goes back to Karl Marx himself. The Communist Manifesto says, the distinguishing feature about communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. And by bourgeois property, Marx meant the means of production that a class of people will own to produce wealth based on the labor of other people. Now, you may say, but wait a second, that's communism, not socialism, right? The two are different. Yes, they are. Don't worry, we'll get to that difference. But at this point, at least, they're the same insofar as they treat private property. Now, it's important to note that socialism doesn't appear out of nowhere. It rose as a reaction to a specific historical situation, namely the 18th and 19th century Industrial Revolution. Before that time, most people in Europe worked the land. Life was hard, often very brutal, people were very poor, but the relationship between work and reward was very clear. The farmer planted, harvested, and from that was able to eat. The craftsman made the shoe, sold the shoe directly to somebody, and got the profits directly for himself. All of that changed with industrialization. Suddenly, production required massive capital investments. Factories, machinery, railroads, and individual craftsmen could not compete with factories. So, workers flooded the city looking for jobs. And these were jobs where people would produce the same thing they produced before, but now the profit was going to somebody else. And the gap between what somebody produced and what they were paid became enormous. The earliest socialist thinkers came from this context. Henri de Saint-Simon argued that society should be rearranged so that the productive workers and not the idle aristocrats should hold the power. Charles Fourier envisioned cooperative communities, phalansteries, where labor would be organized by passion and talent rather than by market forces. Robert Owen, who was actually a Scottish factory owner, tried to build model communities with shorter working hours, education for workers' children, and cooperative ownership. These early socialists were called utopian socialists by Marx and Engels, who considered them well-meaning but philosophically unsophisticated. Marx thought that their vision was too idealistic, too dependent upon the goodwill of reformers, and too disconnected from a serious understanding of how capitalism worked. He set out to provide that analysis himself. So Karl Marx didn't invent socialism, but he gave it its philosophical engine. Almost every serious socialism since Karl Marx either builds on his ideas or defines themselves in opposition to him. So if you want to understand socialism, you have to understand Marx. The starting point for doing so is to understand what his theory of economic value is. It's called the labor theory of value. And actually, Marx didn't invent this himself either. This was invented surprisingly by Adam Smith. But the idea is this. The value of a commodity is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor required to produce that commodity. In other words, if you took a chair versus, let's say, a stump, like a tree stump that you could sit on, two things that do the same thing, but the stump is worthless because nobody did any work to make the stump. Whereas the chair, well, the chair has value because somebody took some amount of time and effort to actually make the chair. That's where the chair gets its value from. Marx takes this theory and asks a pointed question. If labor is the source of value and the worker is the one performing the labor, then why does the factory owner get to keep most of the value? Marx's answer is his theory of exploitation. Here's the idea. Imagine a typical day working at a factory is 8 hours. A factory worker in the first 4 hours, let's say, produces enough value to cover her wages. Marx calls this necessary labor time, the labor needed to reproduce the worker's ability to keep working. Food, shelter, clothing, rest, all the stuff that the worker needs. But the laborer does not go home after 4 hours. She works 4 more hours. The value she produces in those extra 4 hours goes to the owner. Marx calls this surplus value. It's the difference between what the worker produces and what she gets paid. And on Marx's view, this exchange is not fair. It's extraction. The owner contributes capital, machinery, raw materials, but the value of the product comes from the laborer. So the owner's profit, by definition, is unpaid labor. Notice this is not just an economic argument. This is a moral argument. Marx is saying that the basic structure of capitalism is unjust. It systematically takes the value created from the labor and gives it to the owners. Marx's second major contribution is his theory of alienation. He identifies 4 types of alienation under capitalism. First, the worker is alienated from the product of her labor. She makes chairs, but the chairs belong to somebody else. She pours her creative energy into something that is immediately taken from her. Second, she's alienated from the process of labor. She doesn't choose what to make, how to make it, or at what pace. The production process is designed by and for the owner. Her work becomes repetitive, mechanical, and meaningless. Third, she's alienated from her species being. And Marx borrows this idea from Ludwig Feuerbach. The idea is that what makes human beings unique as a species is our capacity for free, conscious, creative production. A spider just weaves by instinct. A human being designs, imagines, creates. But under capitalism, labor is stripped of its creative character and reduced to a means of survival. You don't work because you want to create something. You work because you'll starve if you don't. Fourth, the worker is alienated from other human beings. Capitalism structures human relationships as competitive rather than cooperative. Other workers are competitors for scarce jobs. The owner is an adversary. Marx thinks that naturally we would have this community of shared creative endeavor. But with capitalism, he says that's replaced by a war against all. And the final piece of Marx's philosophical engine is his theory of history, historical materialism. Marx argues that the fundamental driver of historical change is not ideas, not culture, not great individuals, but the material conditions of production. How a society produces the things it needs to survive. Every society, he says, has a base. The economic structure. Who owns the means of production and how production is organized. And it has a superstructure. The political institutions, legal systems, religions, and the ideologies that sit on top of the base. Marx's controversial claim here is that the base determines the superstructure. Your society's laws, the politics, religion, and moral philosophy are, on the final analysis, shaped by and in the service of the economic interests of the class that controls production. On this view, capitalism is not a permanent feature of reality. It's a stage of history, one that emerged from feudalism and will give way to socialism, just as feudalism gave way to capitalism. The mechanism of transition is the struggle, the conflict between those that own the means of production, the bourgeoisie, and those who sell their labor to survive, the proletariat. Now, this is an extraordinarily ambitious claim. Marx is saying, if you want to understand why a society has the laws it has, the religion it has, the moral values it has, just look to who owns the means of production. The ideas are just downstream of the economics. Why did feudal Europe, for example, produce a theology that focused on obedience, hierarchy, and accepting your place in society? Because that theology served the interest of the feudal lords that owned the land. Why did industrial capitalism produce a society that focused on individual rights, free contracts, and the sanctity of private property? Because that philosophy serves the interest of the factory owners. The theory is a very powerful one. Even if we want to reject it, it forces us to ask the question, do I believe what I believe because it's true or because it's convenient to somebody else who owns the stuff? Okay, with the philosophical foundation now in place, let's look at arguments for and against socialism. First is the exploitation argument. We've already kind of seen this one. The claim is that capitalism is structurally unjust because it takes the value produced by the laborers and gives it to people who haven't done anything. On this view, profit is not a reward for risk or entrepreneurship, it's unpaid labor. And this seems to follow directly from the labor theory of value. If you accept that the economic value of a thing is nothing but the labor that was required to produce it, then this seems to follow logically. And even if it's the case that the worker agreed to the situation where part of her labor would be exploited by the owner, that's still unjust because it was an economic necessity, right? That worker had to agree to that or starve. The next argument is the equality argument. Political equality requires roughly economic equality, but private ownership of the means of production produces significant economic inequality. And that inequality tends to increase over time. So political equality is incompatible with capitalism. So there should be collective ownership of the means of production. Third, we have the alienation argument. And the idea here is that even if capitalism is more efficient, even if it were to distribute wealth more equally, it still produces alienation. It turns creative, productive, social creatures into interchangeable units of labor, valued only for their productive output, stripped of their meaningful connection to work and to others. You can even give this a virtue ethics kind of flair by saying this goes against human flourishing. And the fourth argument is the dictatorship argument. In a democratic country, you get to vote. The government can't tell you what to think, where to go, or how to spend your time outside of work. And if the leaders are corrupt or incompetent, you can just vote them out. But once you walk through the factory doors, the owner or the board become the tyrant. They tell you what to produce, how to produce it, what hours you work, what you get paid, and whether you keep your job. You have no vote. You have no representation. If you don't like it, your only option is to leave, which is pretty tyrannical. So the argument goes, if dictatorship is wrong in politics, why is it acceptable in economics? Now, one thing you might have noticed is a lot of these arguments for socialism are more like arguments against capitalism. That's an important observation because, as we'll see, there are some powerful arguments against socialism. For example, the economic calculation problem. This was first given by Ludwig von Mises, and it says that rational economic planning requires weighing the costs and benefits of alternative uses of resources. But comparing costs and benefits require prices for the means of production, capital goods. But genuine prices only arise from market exchange between private owners. Under socialism, the means of production are collectively owned and not exchanged on a market. Therefore, under socialism, there are no genuine prices for capital goods. So, rational economic planning is impossible on socialism. Now, the point here isn't that the central planners in socialism are stupid or corrupt or something like that. The point is that they are necessarily blind. Without market prices, they have no way to know the relative values of different resources. They can't, for example, figure out whether steel is more important to use for cars or for bridges. They can't calculate whether a given means of production is wasteful or efficient. In a market economy, prices do this work automatically. For example, if steel becomes scarce, then its price rises. And that signals to producers to use less of it. It signals to consumers to buy less steel-heavy items. And it signals to entrepreneurs to find substitutes for steel. And notice that no one has to plan this. It happens through millions of decentralized decisions. And each one of these decisions is determined by prices. Here's a way to put it. Imagine that you're a central planner in a socialist society. You need to decide, how many shoes are we going to produce this year? What sizes? What styles? What materials, like leather or synthetic leather? How much leather should we put in shoes versus in jackets? How much synthetic leather should we put in shoes versus in raincoats? Now, in a market economy, you don't need to answer any of these questions. The price system answers it for you. Shoemakers look at the price of everything, what people are willing to pay for them, and then they figure it out. And if they get it wrong, they lose money, but they can adjust. As a central planner, you have to answer all of those questions for all products simultaneously all the time. And you have to do it without the one tool that makes rational planning possible: prices generated by market exchange. Friedrich Hayek actually extended this argument. He pointed out the problem isn't just about calculation, it's about knowledge. The knowledge that we need to allocate resources efficiently is dispersed across millions of individuals. And a lot of it is tacit knowledge, practical know-how knowledge that you can't write down. Now, what the price system does is it takes all of that information and it puts it down into the price. And any individual can act on that price. And he doesn't need to know the full picture in order to do so. For central planning, this is impossible. That's because the relevant knowledge doesn't exist in centralizable form. Now, you might think, well, what about supercomputers? What about AI? Can't we use these great tools to calculate these kinds of things? But the problem isn't computing power. It's that the information itself does not exist until market actors create it through their choices. So prices you can't discover by observation. You actually create prices through exchange. And you can't simulate a market outcome without a market any more than you can simulate a conversation without people that are talking. So the very data that the computer needs in order to do the computation, that's created by the market process. But socialism just abolishes the market process, so the information isn't there. Then there's Hayek's knowledge problem. Even if you could solve the calculation problem, the knowledge you need for economic coordination is not knowledge that you can write down. It's, for example, the knowledge that a local baker has for the preferences of the people that live on his street. It's the knowledge that a foreman has for which machine is starting to wear out. It's the knowledge that a fisherman has for where the fish are this week. And no central planner can have this kind of knowledge. It's like trying to replace a language with a set of instructions. The instructions can't capture what a language does, because the language is a living process. It's not a static thing. So Hayek's point here is that The kind of knowledge that it requires is constantly changing. A lot of times it's tacit, and it's dispersed across millions of people. That's something that you can't centralize. Next is the incentive problem, and this is probably the one that most people know. The idea is that people respond to incentives. Under capitalism, effort, innovation, risk-taking are all rewarded with profits. Under socialism, the rewards of individual effort are distributed collectively. So you don't really have personal incentive for those things that actually generate wealth. And you can think back to the worst group project that you've ever had. It's always the case that one person does most of the work. A few people do some of the work, and somebody's a freeloader. Well, the freeloader doesn't really have incentive to do that much work because they're going to get the same grade based on what the other people are doing. And then the person that's doing the most work has less incentive to do work because they're going to get the same grade as the freeloader. Now, socialists will respond that people are motivated by more than just personal gain. They could be motivated by pride, community, purpose, and solidarity. And that's true sometimes, but socialists will want to build an entire economic system assuming that everybody at all times will be motivated by those things. Historically speaking, that's a bet that has been lost every single time it's been tried. Then there's the freedom argument. And it goes something like this. In capitalist societies, it is very difficult to quit your job and just go find another job. But it's possible. You can do so. So if you don't like who owns the means of production, you can go somewhere else. However, if the government owns the means of production, you can't just quit your job and go somewhere else. They own everything. So private property creates a space of independence, a space where the individual is sovereign, beyond the reach of the collective power. Now, socialists respond, you don't really have that much freedom under capitalism, right? If you are one paycheck away from homelessness, then you can't just so easily up and quit your job. Real freedom requires material security, which socialism provides. But it's still the case, if you look at the two options, that under capitalism, you do have the ability, even though it's a lot less than you would like, to go from one employer to the other, whereas under socialism, you don't have the opportunity to go from one government to the other. And finally, there's the historical track record. Every attempt at socialism in history has produced either economic stagnation, political repression, humanitarian catastrophe, or some combination of those. The Soviet Union, Maoist China, Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge, Cuba, Venezuela, North Korea. The details may differ, but the pattern is remarkably consistent. Central planning fails, shortages appear, the government responds with coercion, the coercion escalates, and civil liberties disappear. Now, socialists will typically respond that either these weren't real socialist governments, or they were state socialism rather than democratic socialism. But again, the other arguments that we've seen have shown how, in each case, the failures are not due just to implementation. The failures are inherent in the idea. So, for example, shoe shortages. We've already seen how it's impossible for a central planning committee to figure out all the people that are going to need shoes and which sizes they're going to need and whether we should use leather or synthetic leather. Historically, countries have had either massive surplus, warehouses full of shoes that nobody can use, or not enough shoes for everybody that needs them. And again, that's because of the calculation problem and the knowledge problem. We've seen from the freedom problem that coercion is just going to go hand in hand with these socialist governments. There's going to be no way for you to walk away from one government to go to a different government like you could go from one company to another company. So every attempt to implement socialism has resulted in these disasters. So philosophers that argue in this way will point out that if every single attempt to implement socialism has been an utter failure, and we have these reasons why, no matter what, the collective ownership of the means of production leads to these failures, then all this historical evidence counts against socialism as an idea in general. So those are the arguments for and against socialism. Now I want to do a little disambiguation. First of all, what is the difference between socialism and communism? Now, as we said before, Karl Marx has argued that socialism is the next step from capitalism. Well, communism would be the next step to socialism, Marx says. Socialism is where the workers seize the means of production, the state is controlled by the working class, and resources are distributed based on contribution. In other words, everybody gets rewarded based on their work. In communism, the state just withers away. It's not necessary anymore. Classes dissolve entirely, and now resources are distributed according to need, not according to contribution. So for Marx, socialism is just a transition phase. But you may wonder, what about the communist countries that we know so far, like of USSR and Maoist China? They had governments, right? And this says that the governments will wither away. That is the result of Lenin. Lenin thought that in order to dissolve the government, first the government needed to take full, violent control. They needed to implement the dictatorship of the proletariat. They needed to stamp out the remnant of the capitalist class. Of course, once those communist governments came into control, they never dissolved, which lead people, of course, to be worried about communism. Isn't communism something we should be frightened of? Now, a lot of socialists today will say, look, we're socialists, not communists. You're really worried about communism, and that's a problem in of itself, but socialism is something totally different. And that might be, but the trouble is that a lot of communists have taken the idea that the ends always justify the means, so that they're willing to lie, steal, and cheat in order to establish communism. It's all worth it if communism gets achieved. So they're willing to say, hey, I just want to be a socialist, but really want to be a communist, which makes it difficult because it's sort of like if you say, well, I just want to be a socialist, well, that's exactly what a communist would say. And I'm not knocking people that just want to be socialists. I'm just saying that that's one of the troubles here. Now, you might think, but what about this democratic socialism that I've heard so much about? Now, democratic socialism is different than socialism as it was practiced before, in that socialism originally, Marx thought that you needed to establish using violent means. Do whatever you can, including killing and whatever needs to be done, in order to seize the means of production. Democratic socialism is the same socialism except for without being implemented with that violence. Instead, it's voted in. This was originally developed by Edward Bernstein, who noticed that capitalist societies were not dissolving like Marx had predicted. He didn't want to wait around for a revolution that he thought probably was not coming. So is democratic socialism better than the original socialism? Well, it's definitely the case that it's better if you don't want violence, right? If you don't want it to be established through violent means, then democratic socialism is a lot better. But whether it's a good idea or not will all be predicated upon those arguments against socialism that we've already seen. Whether or not you voted in, we're still going to have to deal with the knowledge problem. We're still going to have to deal with the calculation problem, the freedom problem. There's still the incentive problem. And you might think, yeah, but at least it was established legitimately. But there is such a thing as the tyranny of the majority. So just because a bunch of people vote something in doesn't actually mean that it is a just thing. For example, if there are 100 people and one of them just got a birthday cake, the 99 might vote that they should all get a piece of the birthday cake. But is that fair to the one that has the birthday cake? Or it could be even worse. The 99 might be racist, and that one might be of that race that they don't like. The 99 could vote to kill the one. So just because we have a majority opinion doesn't make it a just thing. There's also a difference between democratic socialism and social democracy. For a democratic socialist, the goal is the collective ownership of the means of production, like we've said. The method is democracy, and the end goal is a socialist state. For a social democracy, however, the goal is a regulated capitalist economy with a strong welfare state. Again, the method is democracy, but the end goal is still capitalism, just with a bunch of safety nets, labor protections, public services, and redistribution. So if what you're thinking is, I really want welfare, or I really want universal health care, or something like that, then you're not thinking necessarily socialism, not even democratic socialism. You're thinking of the welfare state. Remember that socialism is just about the means of production being owned by the collective. And this is a good segue into whether the Nordic countries are socialist or not. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Are they socialist? The answer is no. They are social democracies with a robust welfare state. But they have capitalist economies, they have billionaires, they have private ownership of the means of production. This is important because a lot of people today, including guys like Bernie Sanders, will point to these countries and say that they are socialist. But that's just not the case. In fact, famously, the Danish Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen gave a speech at Harvard where he pointed out that no, we are not socialist, we are capitalist. Denmark does have free healthcare, generous unemployment benefits, an entire year of maternity leave, and free education. But, he said, these are products of a market economy with just really high taxes. The factories, the businesses, the farms in Denmark are all privately owned. In fact, by some measures, Denmark is even more business friendly than the United States is. And it should be noted that the United States is a social democracy as well. We do have a welfare state. It's just not nearly as generous as Denmark is. So where does this leave us? Well, I think socialism has shown that it has a really good diagnosis of the ills of capitalism. Capitalism does create inequality. It does produce some alienation. Whether or not all the alienation Marx talked about are legitimate can be argued. It is the case that the people that employ those that work for them have a lot more power over them. And it is the case that when you concentrate wealth into the hands of a few, they have the ability to corrupt democratic institutions. But socialism is not just a diagnosis, it's also a prescription. And we've seen from the arguments of von Mises and Hayek, the prescription itself, what we should actually do to collectivize the means of production, we've seen some really powerful arguments against that. And I don't think you can just dismiss the historical evidence. I don't think you can just say, well, if we just run socialism like this, then it'll all work. No, it seems like every time we run it, it's a disaster. So I'm not saying that capitalism is innocent. I'm not even saying that capitalism is the best solution. But in my opinion, socialism is just not going to work. I think the arguments against it are just too powerful and the historical record is damning. But I think the best philosophy happens in dialogue. So let me know what you think in the comments. Also, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And I'll see you in the next video. Adios.